So I'm Don Kerwin. I'm with the Center for Migration Studies of New York, and that's where you are right now. And I wanted to thank you all for joining us today, and I wanted to thank those who are both here and those who are joining us remotely. This is being videoed from back there. What Center for Migration Studies is, it's a think tank on international migration, and it was founded by the Scalabrinian priests 50 years ago. And one of those priests is actually here today, Father Lidio Tomasi, if you would raise his hand. He's one of the original founders of the Scalabrinian International Migration Network, so we're very pleased to have him here. And we're also a member of the Scalabrinian International Migration Network, which goes by the acronym of SIMS, S-I-M-N, and the director of that is here as well, and that is Father Leonir Chiarello, who's in back as well, so it's nice to have him as well. And the SIM runs a network of 270 programs for migrants around the world, often on migration corridors from Central America, South America, including here to the United States. So they do terrific work. So we're here to discuss a new book, a relatively new book, and this is it. It's called The Shared Parish, Latinos, Anglos, and the Future of U.S. Catholicism. And the book is for sale here, and it's also available online through Amazon, and I would strongly recommend it. It's a terrific book. And it was written by this man, Brett Hoover, who's a professor of theological studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And I have to commend Brett because he's either a very brave man or a very reckless man to come to from all the way from warm Southern California to very, very cold, frigid New York to talk to a bunch of fractious New Yorkers about cultural diversity and peaceful coexistence and acceptance of others, immigration in general. But nonetheless, I'm very grateful that he's accepted our invitation and is here with us today. I'm going to provide a more fulsome introduction to the book in just a few moments, but I first wanted to recognize our other respondents here, and they're both acknowledged experts on these issues as well, and we're delighted to have both of them with us today. Mar Muñoz-Visoso is the head of the Secretariat for Cultural Diversity of the Church for the U.S. Bishops' Conference, and I know that the reality of shared parishes is a real reality for her, and an issue of extraordinary importance to the Secretariat as well. Mar is really a visionary leader and a spokesperson on these issues of cultural diversity and pastoral care. And she was formerly the director of Hispanic ministry at the Archdiocese of Denver as well. She's also a member of the CMS's Catholic Immigrant Integration Initiative, which seeks to strengthen the work of Catholic institutions with immigrants and with immigrant communities, and she's been a very, very valuable part of that process. And we can maybe talk about that a little bit later today, and you can read about the initiative too on our website. Father Walter Tonelotto is a Scalabrinian priest, and he's the pastor of Our Lady of Pompeii Parish in Greenwich Village. Father, Our Lady of Pompeii has really played a central role in the integration and assimilation of Italian migrants from the 19th century on. Our Lady of Pompeii, for example, was the parish where the Triangle Shirtwaist fires took place, for better and for worse, happy times and really sad times. And we're in the CMS library, but we're also in the CMS archives right now. So we have this extraordinary collection of archives, historical documents, including from Our Lady of Pompeii, that documents some of the experiences of the parishioners during the Triangle fire. And I should also say that Our Lady of Pompeii no longer just serves, or mostly serves, Italian migrants. It serves Brazilians, it serves Filipinos, it serves people from all sorts of places, and so it's very much a multicultural parish. Father Walter, I should also say, covers migration issues on Radio Maria, which he directs, so please listen. Finally, I wanted to recognize a very special guest today who does not want to be asked to speak at all, and that is Bishop Octavio Cisneros of the Diocese of Brooklyn, who's kind of in the back of the room here. Of particular relevance, please come in. plenty of seats up here. To this event, Bishop Cisneros is a Cuban immigrant himself who came to the United States in 1961 in the Peter Pan program, which has been called an exodus of unaccompanied children. We experienced the exodus from Central America, but this was an exodus of Cuban children. Under this program, which was led by Monsignor Brian Walsh of the Archdiocese of Miami at the time, who I had the privilege to know, and I was first working for the U.S. Bishops' Conference and running their program for Haitian migrants. The church resettled thousands of young people whose parents sent them to the United States to escape from political repression and indoctrination in Cuba. And most of their parents, I think, later joined them here in the United States when they were able to and when they were allowed to leave Cuba. But Peter Pan was really one of the church's most important initiatives and ministries in the United States. And many of these young people became pillars in their communities and national leaders in many different fields, including the immigration field, by the way. So I think the other thing that was very interesting about this program was that it prefigured the church's work with refugee resettlement in the United States. And most recently, its work with child migrants from Central America and elsewhere. Bishop Cisneros has also served as the diocesan coordinator of the Hispanic Apostolate for the Diocese of Brooklyn, and he was president of the Conference of Diocesan Directors for the Spanish Apostolate. So let me turn to, the way we're going to do this today is Brett's going to speak for 15 to 20 minutes about the book, and then we're going to ask our respondents to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. And I wanted to introduce Brett's book because it's such a terrific work. And what it covers is an extraordinarily important issue, and that is how diverse people can build community, or in theological terms, how they build communion around shared beliefs and values and faith in this case. And that's not only one of the most pressing issues for the Catholic Church in the United States and other faith communities in the United States, but it's really an immense challenge for our nation and our world, which is part of what makes the book so compelling to me. This is where the rubber meets the road, and you really kind of see people trying to build communion and trying to live together. The shared parish, it both enunciates the vision that underlies this whole effort, but it also demonstrates how challenging that vision can be to put in practice, okay? And some of the exchanges, the cultural exchanges that you see in this book are really very emotional, they're very raw, they're very heartfelt. And so it's a very human and well-grounded book. Professor Hoover uses this term shared parish to accentuate what he calls the negotiation. And negotiation, that word is a little bit of a euphemism, I would say. But the negotiation that occurs between distinct cultural communities that share space and resources, but that celebrate differently and have different celebrations, ministries, and masses. So what the book is about is it's an ethnographic study of a parish in a majority Protestant city in the Midwest that traditionally served people of German and Irish descent. And in the 1990s, the community and parish experienced a large increase in Mexican immigrants. Okay, so something that we're seeing all over the country, and we've seen all over the country for the last 30 years. And ultimately, the appointment of a Mexican priest led to the transition of All Saints Parish, and I should say that All Saints is a pseudonym, not its real name. We don't know where this took place, and Fred is not going to tell us where it actually took place either. So it went from a parish with a modest Hispanic outreach program to becoming a real shared parish with Spanish language masses and programs and ministries. So let me turn to Brett here and thank him again for coming and ask him to speak for a bit. And then I'll ask Mar and Father Walter to speak from their different expertise and perspectives as well. And what we're trying to do, as in all of our events, is we're trying to devote at least half of the time to dialogue with you all. So I will cut them off, at a certain point. I'm not being rude, but we just want to kind of have that exchange and build that into these dialogues, okay? So thank you, Brett, for being with us.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
It's a wonderful honor to be here at the Center for Migration Studies with all its rich history of research and support for migrants in the United States and elsewhere. I want to talk, I'm just going to get right into it because I know we're under time constraints here. And I want to talk about this notion of the shared parish, which is part of my book. And, what's over there? Yeah, that helps. It does help if you turn it on. The light has gone out. Is it reaching? Ah, we're good. So what I call a shared parish is really a parish, a Catholic parish, where two or more distinct cultural communities are sharing the same parish facilities, and which means they have the same administrative records, and in many cases they have the same leadership, although not in all cases. And each has its own masses and ministries. They're separated. And now, one of the critiques that I sometimes get in Catholic pastoral circles about this is that the shared parish in many ways is really more like 5 different kinds of parishes that are sort of subsumed. So I want to acknowledge that is true. But hopefully the insights that come from this particular study of one might be helpful in our continuing conversation. But so that's kind of what it is. How common are they? Of course, no one has really done a quantitative study to see how many there are in the United States that roughly go according to this model. And there's been some efforts from CARA, but it's a little bit, they're going for a broader notion of what a multicultural parish is than what I'm talking about. But way back in 1999, the Parish study said that 75% of Hispanic Catholic communities shared their church with another group. So that gives you a little bit of sense of where we're going. More recently, many of you know the National Study of Catholic Parishes from the Hispanic Ministry done by Boston College, authored by Hospital Espino, a colleague of mine. And he found that 43% of parishioners at parishes with Hispanic ministry are actually non-Hispanic whites. So in other words, a lot of these, and again, this is looking at it from the Hispanic side, and he actually suggested to me that 90% of those are, that 90% of the parishes that Hispanics attend are actually shared with another group. So even more than in the Parish. But that figure has not yet been made public, so I tentatively assert that. But so one of the things that I did, or I should be more accurate and say that my graduate student research assistant did, was to kind of look around at websites and call dioceses to find out what are the percentage of parishes where Mass is offered in more than one language, which is not a perfect analog for what I'm talking about, but I think it does help to get at it. So there you see some of the different dioceses, and I think the kind of regional variations are probably not surprising to most of us. But one of the most interesting things sometimes is the places where you would least expect there to be a large percentage of parishes. Is that hard to see? I see people. Okay. And even like I did this once before in 2009. This is from 2014, and found, for example, that the Diocese of Baker, Oregon, is about 23%, almost a quarter of its parishes have a Mass in more than one language. And this was a kind of a new one for me. I didn't know that that the eastern half of Oregon was dealing with diversity in this way. But I think part of what it shows is that it's basically everyone in the United States is dealing with this one way or another. So I want to talk specifically about this parish of All Saints in Havenville, which is Don said, is a pseudonym. I want to protect the identity of the people that I researched. They trusted me with this information. And it is a town, as Don said, transformed by migration, mostly from Mexico. It is a town that had some history of Hispanic migration before that, but in very, very low numbers, and mainly because of the local Anabaptist traditions, which had a missionary history. But you see how quickly this happened. And it's really part right of this trend of post-1990 migration, where people are migrating not to the traditional border states or immigration states, but to other places in the country, like the Midwest, the Southeast, and the Northwest. So it really kind of falls in that line. You also see something about the generational issues here that, as we know from larger statistics, that immigrants have more children than U.S.-born people do. And so as a result, you look at how much higher the numbers of kids in school are, and you get kind of an idea of what this town is going to look like in 30 years, in 20 years or so. But one of the kind of funny things that happened there is that it was sort of a town with what I call a bifurcation of cultures. In that even though, many places like where I live in Los Angeles, there's no parish that could be described this way. In every parish, you go to the English Mass, it's not Anglo people, it's Anglo people and Filipino people and Chinese people and Vietnamese people who are second generation. But here, almost everybody that attended the English Masses was Anglo-Midwestern. And most of them who had grown up in the States in most of their lives. And almost everyone in the Hispanic community was from Mexico. Most of them immigrants within the last 15 years. So it kind of got this feel that things got maybe unnecessarily bifurcated into two groups which thought of themselves as opposites. But the thing that I wanted to focus on is this kind of idea of negotiating the parish. I think a shared parish kind of institutionalizes both separation and having to negotiate to share. And I think in some ways the separation is interesting. Like, for example, I asked a woman in the parish, someone who wasn't very involved, I was just talking to her at the back of the parish, so what do you think about sharing the parish with the Anglo community? And her response to me was, no me afecta. It doesn't affect me. And I think for a lot of people, that's what the experience of the parish was like. They really didn't know much about the other community. And, that has its advantages, right? In terms of helping, first of all, people who are immigrants and are very insecure in their position. Many people in this town were undocumented, many. And it gives them kind of a safe space to gather together, where they don't feel that they're, working as they did in many of the factories where they worked for whites who didn't understand them. They don't feel threatened. They feel like it's a safe space. I think it's also helpful for Anglos, as there's this gigantic demographic changes going on around them, to kind of give them a place where they can slowly adjust. So I think there's advantages. Now there's disadvantages. You see that. But I also, I think that to kind of help give you a feel for what this is like, which Don said I think is the strength of the book, I just wanted to share a few anecdotes about the different kind of negotiating that went on at this parish, which I've certainly seen in other places as well. So a lot of the negotiating, actually, you might say, was negotiating how to avoid one another. Because it's risky, some of you might be familiar with intercultural communication theory, where they really say that part of what makes it hard to cross cultures is because we feel anxious when we don't know how to read the reactions of other people, and we feel uncertain. And so nobody wants to do this. So part of what the negotiation was about was how can we keep out of each other's way? And little things like people would say, well, after the 10 o'clock Mass, you always park on the street and not in the parking lot. Because if you park in the parking lot, you might have to end up negotiating with someone who's parked behind you, or, et cetera, et cetera. So just park on the street. Where it was another parking thing, and for those of you who do pastoral ministry, not in New York, but in other places, parking is about 50% of what we're dealing with, it seems like. But and somebody, the priest there, who I call Padre Nacho, he once instructed this gathering of Hispanic people from different sites who had gathered for a workshop, on what kind of the 5 rules of parking were at All Saints. And he was explicit about saying, the reason we do this is so that, that we don't get in trouble with the Anglos, they don't notice that we're here, that he was very explicit about trying to stay out of people's way. But avoidance doesn't, now I think it also has a pressure releasing factor. One of the things, when you're among your own people, you can talk about things that are difficult in ways that you might not want to talk about in front of the other group, right? For example, so there's kind of pressure releasing. I was having dinner with a family, and they kept making jokes about their undocumented status. The father of the family said, "Oh yeah, Brett, the only papers in this house are in the bathroom." And then he said, he was talking about, it was 2008, he was talking about the election. He said, well, yeah, we're voting for Obama, but only at the kitchen table. And so there was this kind of like relief at being able to be open about this and joke about it. But it also kind of happened on the Anglo side. There was a man who was part of my little research team. I had a research team of parishioners. And who I knew had very ambivalent feelings about immigration in the town, and I put him there on purpose because of this. He was very respectful and gracious as being part of the team. But then when it was just me and him, because he read me, other white guy, he would talk about what his friends said about immigrants being scofflaws or people that don't respect the system or the kind of things that I'm sure you've heard many times. But he felt like he could talk about that there, but he didn't, of course, want to bring this up or sound disrespectful in front of the whole group. Now, this kind of avoidance, though, is not always successful in these parishes, and particularly at All Saints. And so when people had to negotiate face-to-face, as Don implied, they almost always found it difficult. I would even say fraught, emotionally complex, challenging, and in part because of the anxiety issue, but also for different reasons. And the reason, I think, for the Anglo population had a lot to do with this enormous change that was overtaking their city, and they kind of felt grief, honestly. And some of you might know Father Stephen Dudek, who has written on this subject, and he talks about shared parishes as, he calls them crucibles of grief. Because you have immigrants that have left their homeland, their families, and then you have people whose town is whole changed. They don't recognize their neighborhood, they don't recognize the businesses, the music, the food, and so everybody's kind of grieving what's gone. And just as an example of this, there's a wonderful story that a woman told me about. She was holding a meeting in the basement of the church, and suddenly she realized that a Hispanic group was still having a meeting and they were supposed to be gone. And so she was trying to ask them if they would, and they were using the whole basement, if they would move to one side so she could have her meeting on the other side. And of course she kept talking to people, and people were saying, no hablo inglés, no hablo inglés, no hablo inglés. And finally she found somebody who spoke English, and when they realized what was happening, they were more than happy to move to the other side of the basement so both groups could have their meeting. But let me tell you what she said to me about this afterwards. It gives you a sense of the kind of emotional fraughtness. She was still annoyed. This was like 2 or 3 weeks after it had happened. And she said, I've supported this parish for 40-some years, not tremendously financially, but I've been a big part of it. I've tried to put myself into it, and I should count for something. Now, as far as I can tell, she did count for something. She was a leader of a major group. She was a friend of the pastor. She had a lot of influence, actually, with him. So part of me in asking the question, why did she feel this way? And I think this anger, a lot of it has to do with grief. That the world has changed and I don't know how to handle it. On the other side, I think that these negotiations were very fraught on the Hispanic side for a different reason. And I think that has more to do with a perception on their side, which was largely accurate, of being persons without power, without influence. And I kind of draw your attention to a particular story which I think is fun, although it was very difficult at the time, which is about the parish directory. And again, it's always about these kind of things, right? It's about parking, it's about parish directories, it's not about the Trinity or transubstantiation. And so there was a parish directory, one of those Facebooks put out, with all the different people's faces in it. And it had no pictures from the Hispanic ministries of the parish, even though there were several from the Anglo ministries. And so one of the guy who was the volunteer director of religious education, in the book I call him Javier Moreno. Javier comes to me and he said, I need to say something to my fellow parish council members about this. He goes, and normally he would speak in English at the group, but he said, I'm going to speak in Spanish and I want you to translate for me. So I said, okay. And he gave this very detailed account of the Hispanic ministry at the parish. He told how many people were in each group. He talked about what activities were happening, how long they'd been happening. Hello. And he did this in a very serious voice, kind of professional presentation almost. This was very shocking to the Anglo members of the parish council, who had been very informal with them, who had joked around with them, who had not seen him behave like this. And they almost felt like he was giving them a lecture, which in a way he was. And but I think one of the insights I had into that experience, and I'll tell you in a second how it turned out, was that for Javier, there was a lot of risk involved in this. He had to screw up his courage to do it, because he himself was undocumented, his family was entirely undocumented, almost everybody he knew was undocumented. He also felt like he had some pull in the parish, but not enough really to get the things done he wanted for the Hispanic community. So to come and confront a mostly Anglo parish council. It was about, I think it was about 9 Anglo members and 3 Hispanic members. About this, it was taking a tremendous risk as he saw it, and but he felt that it was important. He did, and not surprisingly, the Anglo people in the parish council were very shocked. They were very upset, and they felt attacked, and it was hard. There was an argument ensued, and it became clear in that argument that ensued what had happened, why this had happened, and that is that the Anglo people, the almost entirely Anglo committee that was doing the parish directory, had gone to the wrong person to get pictures. They had gone to the priest secretary who really didn't know the community that well, when they should have gone to either the priest himself or to the heads of the different ministries. There was a group of heads of ministries, of the Hispanic ministries, that would meet regularly. If they had gone to that group, they would have the pictures in 5 seconds. But part of the problem with the avoidance and the separation that I was talking about, or the challenge, I should say, is that they didn't know where to go. And part of the avoidance is sometimes real important information is never goes back and forth across the cultural area. How am I doing on time? Yeah. And the pastor, who was a person who did not like conflict, which by the way, if you're a bishop or a religious superior and you're assigning people to multicultural contexts, don't assign someone that's afraid of conflict. It's not going to work. But he immediately kind of complained about Monday morning quarterbacking, and which is something, maybe you all know what that means. I had to explain it to my undergraduate students when I told this story. They didn't know what it meant. And he got very upset. But it was, I think for me, the story illustrated, though, the kind of the power imbalance, and also the invisibility of the power imbalance to the Anglo population. They were not aware of their own sense of influence and power in the parish. And just to kind of get at how complicated these power dynamics, before I finish up, I want to tell you a story about a different research project. I forgot to do that one. And this is where I'm doing a multi-parish study in Southern California, also shared parishes, but with different combinations of cultures and power dynamics. And I want to tell you a story about a kind of kerfuffle, which is not in the book, that happened there, over a parish, I call it Holy Nativity, that's not its name, which was a historically African-American parish with a Central American community that had nevertheless been present for decades. And the pastor kind of sums it up there. I'm not going to read that for you, but basically a group of African-American parishioners wanted to put the word Hispanic in the mission statement of the parish, which had not appeared. It was in the parish mission statement was very focused on Afrocentrism, and they didn't want to change that. They just wanted to include the fact that the parish included Hispanic people, and it led to like a 6-month fight that was only resolved by the regional bishop. In Los Angeles, we have regional bishops for each for different vicariates underneath the archbishop. And here's some reactions that people had. The director of religious education, who was African American, described the kind of kerfuffle as, we saw ourselves fading into oblivion. And a Latino parishioner said that one of his African American friends from the parish said, look, we're going to tell you something specific. The African American community foresees that you are going to displace them. So part of the reason, now some of this is a story about demographics, that the African American community of the parish did not live in the area anymore. But they still dominated the kind of leadership and activities of the parish. But part of the story of this is how many fewer African American Catholic parishes there are in Los Angeles than there were 30 years ago. So part of the story of this is feeling like you're disappearing. And part of it is the age dynamics. The Hispanic community was young, the African American community is older. But part of it is also 2 different groups that both see each other, both see themselves as not possessing as much influence or power in the culture as they ought to. And that when they suddenly found themselves in a battle against one another, they both went into defensive positions. And I think also it says something about grief, and it says something about the Hispanic community there that never quite feeling like they were at home. So I guess my point is that you think the power dynamics are complicated when it's a dominant Anglo culture who's been around for years and knows how everything works, and it's a new immigrant community that doesn't. It gets even more complicated when you have multiple cultural groups with multiple power places in the society. Just kind of to go back to All Saints, I think I'm going to skip what I was going to say about assimilation, because there was a small number of people that were really pushing assimilation at All Saints, and I think I'm just going to skip that. But I want to say why I feel hopeful for the future, despite the complexity of these negotiations, and that's I wanted to read you something that one of the sacristans of the parish said to me. He was this was a very saintly man, and he said about Latino parishioners in the parish. He himself didn't speak Spanish, didn't know that many people. You don't want them to feel uneasy. That's the last thing you want the Hispanics to feel. And if they can't speak English, well then that's fine. At least we want them to know that. So there was this sense, and he expressed what theologically I would call biblical hospitality. In other words, a hospitality that's not only about welcoming people and being nice to them, but that is saying, God speaks to us in strangers. And if we don't welcome the strangers, then we won't get the message. And I think he really believed that, that Christ was present in all these different strangers that were coming to them. And he wanted to know their stories. He wanted to know about them. Even though the language barrier, and I think there's always people like that in our parishes. Even with the power dynamics, even with people feeling grief, even with people feeling anger and resistance. And so that's one of the reasons I'm hopeful. I'm also hopeful because a lot of people from the dominant culture get converted to activism when they really learn what people's stories were like. So in this research group I had, which was half Latino and half Anglo, we did everything bilingually because there were many people that couldn't speak the other language. There was a former professor. When she heard the story, the immigration stories of some of the people in the group when I asked them to share how they got to the United States, that turned her into an immigration activist. Because she had no idea how difficult people's stories were, how much suffering they've been through, how much sadness they'd endured. And the same thing happened when I taught a class in California, where it was a mixed class and I asked people to share their family immigration stories, whether it was recent or long ago. And when some of the students heard the stories of people that they had been going to school with in a cohort for 3 years, when they suddenly heard their stories and realized how much suffering was involved, it also turned them into immigration activists. So I'm hopeful for those reasons. I'm also hopeful that by being hopeful, I mean hopeful. I don't mean optimistic. I don't mean that it's easy. I don't mean that these cultural differences, which are hard to navigate, or power differences, which are invisible to some and obvious to others, are going away. But I do mean that I think there are signs there that and strengths and resources and outlooks that are building up that will help us in this long-term struggle. But I'm just going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share with you my experience as a priest, as Caribbean pastor now in Our Lady of Pompeii in the village in New York. A lot of what Brett said really resonate in my experience down in downtown New York. But most of all, I'm facing double problems because we have 4 communities instead of 2 or 3. And these 4 communities are trying to kind of find their own space in the same institution, the same church. So first of all, let me say that I am there just a year and a half. And when I came in, I found the old Italian community almost dead. There was about 10, 20, 15 people at Mass, very old type of liturgy. And there was like a sense of defeat. They had built a church, their grandparents, their parents, but now it seemed that it was all finished. So we started looking out for newer Italians. And we found out that in Manhattan alone, through Google, there are 60,000 Italians. I couldn't believe my eyes. So what we started doing is to get into the social media. We started organizing activities that could reach out to them. And we started, for instance, last year we brought the Giotto paintings from Cappella Scrovegno, Padua, here in the church. And we went into the social media. You know that we had 30,000 visits in the web page just for that event. Then we organized a school of painting from an Italian artist, and in about 2 months, 170,000 people went into the web page to visit. So we really saw that the only way we could reach these new Italians was through the social media. And we found a nice group of young professionals, because these people are all working in the banks or the companies that they send them over from Italy. They are here for 3 or 5 years, but they are very interested because they come from Christian movements in Italy. And so when they come here, they want to continue. So we found about 15 young professionals who are very interested. And last Christmas night, we had 600 people in church. So from 10:15 now we are out. And ordinarily now is the biggest community because they start new music, they start getting together, they in Facebook, they talk to each other almost every day. And so there is a new wave of Italian immigrants, which sometimes is not well accepted by the older guys, because, like I said, they feel that they're being pushed out. And some of my dear older ladies are very jealous of the younger ladies that come in the parish. So, but this is something very new, very profitable, and very successful in a way. And we want to continue to be on the social media, because they are there. And if we don't go there, they don't see us. They don't, as you know, we have Radio Maria is reaching out to thousands and thousands of people, and we continue that. We are opening a TV web page in Italian so that they can see the Mass through the church streaming. And so we are really trying to cater to this new group of Italians. And every Thursday night they have a rosary in some of the apartments around here in Manhattan. And like they are really committed to their faith. And the next group would be the Filipinos. The Filipinos have been there for 25 years. Father Bob Season started this ministry a long time ago. And the Filipinos, like I said, are very quiet, very, and in the parish now there's the group that organizes the celebrations, the procession, the feast, all kind of help that we get from for the church now today is from the Filipino community, because they've been almost like they feel it's their church. Something interesting here, last year there was no Filipino priest because we couldn't get one. And the community went down, very much so. Then finally this year we have a Filipino priest and the community is coming back. We have to understand that for the Filipinos, the priest is the liaison. The priest is the one that really gathers the community. So once the priest goes, the community goes. And they wait until the next priest comes. It is a very personal relation, not the institution. Because after all, they have many churches here in the city where they can go, where they have Filipino groups. But their relationship is a personal one toward the priest. The Brazilian has been there for many years, actually probably at the same time of the Filipinos. And the Brazilians, they collect, they reunite many different immigrants, even from different regions. They come from New Jersey, from Queens, from up New York, and they have been there for a long time. And the very good, I mean, the secret is that there were always Brazilian priests in that church. And that makes a lot of difference, because they have their own feast. Like the other day they had the Mardi Gras, they have their own celebrations, they have their own national, they have the churrasco. So somehow they recreated a little bit of Brazil there around the community. And I think that the Brazilian community has a very strong identity, but sometimes they do not really get mixed with the other groups. So they tend to be on their own, and even though, in this sense, they have a very great sense of fidelity and to support the church. And they have their own dismo, they have their own system, but it is very important. And then finally we started the Latinos, the Hispanics. Now for the Hispanics is very difficult and very different. First of all, they do not live in the cities. They work most of the restaurants in the village. They come into work and they go home. And if, for instance, I was surprised that when they have the confessions, when they have the reconciliation Monday, I heard confession in Spanish from 3 to 9, because that's something that they can do. They get out of the restaurant for a while, they go to confession, then they go back to work. So to organize the Spanish community is going to be a little challenge. I found out that probably half of them, they come from the old Spain immigrants, like not Latino, but from Spain. There are around the village, there is a good number of immigrants directly from Spain. So this is my experience, and I would like to close saying that the experience of Pompeii probably is going to be the experience of many other parishes, especially in the big cities, because they are there. And if you open the door, they come in. For instance, one thing that they really appreciate is the door open of the church. We open the door at 7 and we close at 9 at night. And people come in and out continuously. And many Hispanics, they come in, I see them in their faces, because they go there, they kneel in front of the altar, they go to the Padre Pio, they go to the Mercy, the Sacred Heart, and you see that they are relating because it is open. Finally, I would say that the parish today cannot be limited to the liturgical aspect, because if a parish does not open up through the media, through the activities, through social events, because a lot of people, for instance, the painting of Giotto are very, very clear, but attracted a lot of people. We had the Eric Chavez, the nephew of Cesar Chavez, to present the movie. And a lot of people came because they were connected with this movement of justice. So if the parish does not go out and somehow presents different aspects, then the parish is going to go, becomes insignificant. The people don't care. But once that the parish go out, imagine if every parish would have a Facebook account. You know how many millions of people we can reach every day, and it will be it will be something very, very important. In my account, in our parish account, there's at least 5,000 people every week going through and checking the bulletin, checking what's happening, and that is a great, great advantage. I put there something very fast, but maybe we can give for more time. How a parish can respond to all these. First of all, welcome. Welcome to the next one. Welcome is important, because if they don't see you smiling, they are afraid of you. And even if you say something, you have to be very careful what you say. I remember when I was in Chinatown for the Chinese, in the beginning I started shaking hands, and the ladies were kind of pulling their hands back, because it is too much of a familiarity to shake hands with them. So you have to go like this. Then I learned that to say hello to the lady, you don't have to shake hands. So, but you have to learn how to feel them welcome. Secondly is the liturgy. It has to be in their language, or sometimes in emergency. And if you have your priest, if you have the leaders, and especially the music and the choir. I remember Christmas night about 3 years ago, the Chinese, they sing the rosary, and they start 8 o'clock at night until midnight. And so we couldn't have other masses. So I put the Spanish in one church, St. James, and I gave the church to the Chinese. The Chinese loved it so much that it turned completely their attitude, because they say, now we can do our own preparation to Christmas the way they did. And so then that's this one. Then besides the liturgy, you have the social needs. For instance, we started a Scalabrini Center for the immigrants. You know what? One of the parish members says, you are doing something illegal because you are helping the illegals, and the church cannot do something illegal. So says, okay, he says, but you know, they are our brothers and sisters, and we try to help them. We try to bring them into to become legal, if possible. Then the gathering, the feast, the celebration, they have to do in their own. I want to close just saying, the experience very interesting. You know, in New York, we have the Cardinal's Appeal. So the nice lady, Daniela, comes and says, Father, we need all the list of your parishioners, we need all the addresses, we have to send them a letter. And I says, wait, there is no addresses, because 80% of them are illegal. They have no checkbooks because they cannot open a checking account. Secondly, he says, they think they will never tell you anything because they are afraid they are going to pick them up. So he says, let them do their own. So I went to a couple, and I says, you handle the Cardinal's Appeal. Good, Father, we'll do it. We had to pay $14,000. The first Sunday was 7 already there. You know what they do? This couple, which is very trusted by the Chinese, they stand at the door and they collect 50, 100, 50, 100. You know that year we paid more than what the diocese was requesting. Everything by hand, by cash. And then I told the lady, I said, you see, if we do the things their way, then they will respond. If we do things our way, they stay away, they don't mingle. So I think it is very interesting to see how the parish will develop in the future. Here in the big cities, we already are into it, in the middle of it, but this probably is going to spread maybe throughout the country.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. So I have three main ideas for my participation today and for the response that I was asked to give. First, I want to say to Brett that I am most intrigued by where this community of All Saints is, because I've been trying to compare notes and footnotes to see if I can pin down. Because if you combine all of the experiences that I had in Denver as director of Hispanic ministries for about 12 years, you could put together All Saints, the Parish of All Saints. It really, I related so much to the stories that he's telling in the book, to the negotiations that were going on, to the realities that he spoke of, that I thought, my goodness, this is the story of my life. A few years ago, and all of the communities that were involved in those negotiations in Denver, which was, mostly an Anglo, and some Mexican American, and a huge influx of Mexicans. So I do recommend you read the book, because it really goes deep into the realities of what the shared parishes are. These parishes that are no longer homogeneous, that are welcoming immigrants of all kinds. So three main ideas behind my participation today. One is the history, the memoria histórica, we say in Spanish, the history of behind the need and the current push for the acquisition of intercultural competence at all levels in the church in the United States today. The second one has to do with the new evangelization, which also Brett talks about in the book as being something particularly owned by the Latino community, the Hispanic community, and that you will see that, in a sense, their own diversity has prepared them, to share this gift with the church. So the new evangelization and the rediscovering of the missionary identity of the parish, and the need to build intercultural competence among the leadership, ordained or lay. And the third idea is the best practices for shared parishes. And this is a resource that the Bishops' Conference has put together, but actually with the help from a lot of pastors from around the country that share their best practices. And so the Secretariat in the Committee on Cultural Diversity gathered those, actually with the help of Brett too, who helped us put together the original white paper, and then we also combine all of those stories together to give some of those examples. So best practices for shared parishes, which is kind of really is a practical tool for self-assessment and pastoral planning with cultural diverse communities. So a little bit of the history. See, the Bishops' Conference didn't all of a sudden come up with the idea of putting together building intercultural competence for ministers or best practices for shared parishes. The bishops usually don't meddle into the business of the pastors too much unless they have to, unless they see that there is a real need to push for something. So how did they got into this thing of pushing for people to acquire intercultural competencies and of providing examples that pastors had given of what are the best practices, like the ones, Father just shared with us in his parish? Well, shared parishes have existed in the United States since the foundation, since the church arrived in the United States, because it's an immigrant church, and it was founded by many communities. And as Brett says in the book too, really the experience of religion and religiosity ends up being a local experience. And this construct that we think of American Catholicism today is a fairly recent development that really forgets or has selective memory about how different communities settle in different parts of the country and were influenced by their experience of church. The Italians did, the Irish did, the Germans did, the Mexicans did, the Spanish did, etc., etc. Cubans did, etc. And so all of those experiences have marked, what today we understand as the mainstream of American Catholicism, because they all have contributed, like streams. But depending on where you were and the circumstances that surrounded you, then it marked, the way you read that reality. So a little more recent history, I wanted to bring to your attention that in the year 2000, the Church in the United States celebrated Encuentro 2000, ushered by the Latino community and rooted in their experience of encuentro, encounter, where 4,000 Catholics of diverse races, ethnic groups, and cultures present in the United States gathered at the Convention Center in Los Angeles. And they gathered to celebrate the Church's Catholicity, its unity in diversity. Some have prepared for it by experiencing and carrying on the Many Faces in God's House, which was, also a resource offered by the Bishops' Conference as a, parish dialogue of, sharing experiences of how, when did you become Catholic, where are you Catholic, were you part of the founding community of this parish, etc. Some are prepared, some just simply arrived there to celebrate what actually became the national event of the Jubilee. And so there we celebrated again the Church's Catholicity, meaning universal, but also its diversity. And, excuse me. So many people from the vast majority of dioceses participated there, and nonetheless, I must say, I was there, but I observed that the Catholics from, what we would say, Anglo or European, American, different names that we give, to our different communities and all those tags that we impose on each other, we're present there, but we're relatively underrepresented for their size of the population, which already was interesting. It almost seemed like the encuentro was for everybody else, and for those who have a culture. Well, wait a minute. Everybody has a culture, and white is a color too. But that was something interesting. That was eye-opening, because we were there to celebrate the diversity of the church. Yet it seemed like there was some groups that were more or less willing to participate or to dialogue about this. I can remember very well during the encuentro that at the sending mass, Cardinal Mahoney at the beginning of the mass said, "Well, look around you, and say a greeting to your neighbors around you. Look around you, and realize this is what heaven is gonna look like." Now, we Latinos sometimes tend to make fun of everything, and I say, well, if it wasn't for prayer and a lot of goodwill, this is how hell sometimes can look like too. Anyway, but that was a beautiful realization, really, looking around and say, all of us together are the community of the beloved. All of us together praying in our own languages. And I came to realize that when at the time of the Our Father, he said, well, and now you can pray the Our Father in your own language. My goodness, that passage that says, every tongue and nation, Lord, let it praise you. It was being realized right there, right now. And it was so beautiful. Anyway, I'm going to move on from the encuentro because also, as a result of that, if the encuentro was a celebration, then also another step was taken with the Cultural Diversity Convocation. In 2007, after its own restructuring, the US Catholic bishops made recognition and affirmation of cultural diversity in the church one of the top 5 priorities of their strategic plan. In order to better respond to this growing reality across parishes and dioceses in the United States. One event and 2 main projects came out of it. One was the convocation. The convocation brought together nationally recognized leaders from the different cultural ethnic families that were grouped in kind of 6 broad categories. The white Anglo-Euro-American, the African American, the Asian and Pacific Islanders, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, and a catch-all category that we call migrants, refugees, and travelers, and new immigrants. Those who, have smaller groups that don't, fit under any of the other labels. This was an interesting experiment, to say the least. You were there, Brett? You were there, yes. And I think you referred to it in the part of the book. If it was on the convocation, because it's not by name, but the experience that you described, I thought you were referring to it. It was very interesting because if the encuentro had been, a call to attention and a celebration, the convocation was a call to dialogue, a call to sharing and reflecting on equal footing. All the families were invited to highlight for themselves and for others their history of faith, their joys and gifts, their sorrows and fears. And I say that this negotiating of identity proved an interesting experience because neither group was used to negotiate or dialogue on those terms. And if you read the book, you will realize this is not the way it happens in the parishes. Yes? So you will see the so-called mainstream groups, in some cases, because it's not the case that everywhere in the country the Euro-Americans are, the mainstream group, but, the Euro-Americans, for example, were not used to have to explain themselves or to justify their ways in front of others. They were just common sense, right? They were just the way it is. This is the way we've always done it. Finding commonalities in their group, traits for their culture, was a possible proposition. However, once they dug deeper, they discovered a lot of diversity in their respective histories of faith. And they were able to put together a set of common traits and expectations, areas to be proud of in their history of faith, as well as fears and anxieties. They too discover the faith and religious practices in a locally informed proposition. On the other hand, the other groups were really not used to have their full undivided attention of the so-called mainstream, the ones who cortan el queso, the ones who make the decisions. And so it felt a little bit intimidating too. And we really all had to make an effort to articulate in an understandable manner for others, why we celebrate the way we celebrate, or why we, pay respect to the traditions that we do, etc., etc. The Native American family, for example, went as far as to say that it was the first time in the history of the church in the United States that they have felt listened to at the national level. The first time. So in the end, we all realized that in our diversity there were many commonalities and things that united us, above all our faith, but also that there were many differences, some of them painful. And that diversity has pastoral consequences. That in ministry, one size fits all does not work. In other words, one size does not fit all. Parallel to the convocation, but also enriched by this experience, then these two other main projects emerged. One was the development of a set of guidelines for building intercultural competence for ministers. And the other one is the best practices in shared parishes. About the building intercultural competence, all I want to say is that really the attention to cultural diversity is more than a practical matter. It really is grounded in the need, in the urgent need to grow in the knowledge and to develop the appropriate attitudes and skills for carrying out the church's mission of evangelization. So again, the three kind of key elements of this intercultural competence are knowledge, attitude, and skills, but not for their own sake, for the sake of carrying out the mission of the church, which is go and make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit, and teach them everything that I have taught you. So that is our mission. Every parish should have at their mission. And in the United States, you really don't need to go too far away to find people of all nations. Do it. Don't. I'm not going to delve a lot, but I want to say that in building intercultural competence, there are kind of 5 guidelines that were kind of identified and that the bishops are encouraging communities and ministers to develop. One is framing the issues of diversity theological in terms of the church's identity and mission. The second one, understanding culture and how it works. The third, develop intercultural communication skills in pastoral settings. The fourth, expands one's knowledge of the obstacles which impede effective intercultural relations, namely stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, racism, which are present in our communities. And finally, foster ecclesial integration and inclusion rather than assimilation in church settings, with a spirituality of hospitality, reconciliation, and mission. And especially keeping in mind that integration is a process that has several stages. So as a final thought, number 3, one of the activities that were also recommended was the development of this practical guide to assist pastors and of cultural diverse parishes in the challenging task of building unity and diversity. Such a guide was considered important and urgent, since the number of parishes shared by culturally diverse communities have grown dramatically in the previous decade. Actually, CARA estimates that of all the church parishes in the United States, this new model of parish, the shared parish, grew from 22% in 2000 to 33% in 2010. A more recent estimate, verbal estimate from CARA, actually puts that number already at 36%. So as you see, and there's a lot of factors that intervene with this. It's just sheer numbers, the growing diversity in our communities, the merging and closing of parishes, that is happening in some parts of the country, particularly in the Northeast and the Northwest. So really, it has three parts, and I don't have time to go deeper, but I just wanted to put them in front of you, because the first one is really using, it's a self-assessment tool that helps community use the stages of intercultural sensitivity to assess where they are in the continuum, where we are as an individuals, but where we are also as a parish. And this is following the kind of the paradigm or the schema developed by Milton Bennett. So those 6 stages of intercultural sensitivity that go from an original process of denial, defensiveness, and minimization to accepting, adapting, and integrating a new reality. Part 2 really articulates the spirituality that accompanies it, that should accompany that, both from the priest but also from the parish leaders. And then from those new leaders that are going to be developed from those new communities coming in. And finally, part 3 offers a 3-fresco roadmap that illustrates how parishes have been successful in building unity and diversity among cultural diverse members. So these 3 thresholds are welcoming, belonging, and ownership. So it is a process, and each process has, there's many ways of dividing it, but each process has about 3 movements under it. And if we don't realize that it is a process, and where we are in the process, it's very easy to get stuck. And that's where those parallel communities that form sometimes can become eternal, instead of circles that come and intersect in the parish, the understanding of the parish as a community of communities. You're never going to have, one perfect yellow dot, smiling dot. You're going to have communities that intersect, and you're going to have, perhaps those circles at the beginning don't intersect a lot. But it is important to strengthen them. Why? Because the same way that we used to have the national parishes or the ethnic parishes, people integrate better from a position of strength. So those circles at the beginning, those kind of seemingly isolated communities, it's good to strengthen them, and allow them to develop their own ministries. But at some point we need to start building bridges. They will still be part of that community that will never intersect. And they will still part of the receiving community who are afraid of the newcomers, who will never intersect. But hopefully, along the way and along the process, we're bringing communities together. And then there will be intersection in the leadership, there will be common opportunities for formation, and there will be opportunities also for the new leaders from the new communities to be, to be identified, to be mentored, and to be offer training opportunities, so they too can exercise leadership, not just for their community, but for the entire parish community. So I'm going to leave it there, and I hope that.
Thanks. So thanks very much. Questions, comments? I mean, I have some too, but I want to give you all the opportunity. Alejandro, yeah, if you could introduce yourself too, we have another.
Alejandro Aguilera Titles from the USCCB. And I was intrigued in the verb describing this gathering, the word congregation, how parishes could work or should work as congregations in an organizational manner. And that was pretty intriguing to me. So I would like to understand, Brett, what do you mean by that? Because it seems like we are not a congregational church. But so how do you look at that wording in the context of your?
Yeah, some of that is because part of the audience for the book is people in religious studies and social sciences, and in the sociology of religion, what's called the new paradigm, there's a kind of tendency, which you and I have talked about this before, but there's a kind of way of thinking that all religious communities tend toward the congregation in the United States. And the congregation is what's meant by that is a voluntary gathering of people with lay leadership and kind of local control. Now, I think one of the difficulties with this, and the contention of many sociologists is that Catholic parishes tend toward this model in the United States too. there's truth to this. I think we have to acknowledge it, that in part because of the separation of church and state and the kind of the way we think of society is made up of individuals in the United States, both legally and culturally, there is a tendency to think about church in terms of voluntarism and being voluntary. People don't have to come, or people don't even really feel obligated because they're part of a culture in many cases. So there is a voluntary nature to but part of the reason why I use that is because it's the term in sociology. But one of the things I say in the book is that, you know, I kind of ask this question: are Catholic parishes really congregational? And you know, in some ways they are. For example, like with parish shopping. You know, and I mean, we know now that people don't go to the parish that's next door to them, or many of them don't anyway. And there's ample evidence to suggest that people choose where to go, especially in urban areas. And but on the other hand, there's a centralized power structure in Catholicism that is just nothing like a congregation. You know, that like for example, if a shared parish forms, it's basically because the bishop says it forms. And that, I mean, there's nothing in Protestant polity, most Protestant polity, to kind of make space for that. That's not, it's a different thing. But I think it does happen sometimes actually in Orthodox or Coptic churches. It's usually then it's the difference between immigrants and the native born. But so I think that's kind of what I was getting at. That in fact, I use the term, I like the J. Dolan, the historian's term, the congregational parish, which seems like a contradiction in terms. Because without getting too far afield in that, that's kind of where that was going.
Thank you.
Yes.
Beth Griffin from Catholic News Service. Father, you were talking about how the importance of the dynamics of the shared parish in your area had a lot to do with the presence of the strong Filipino priest and the presence of the Brazilian priest, and clearly you're there being able to deal with several other of the groups there. How do you altogether, anyone who wants to answer this, how do you make that work now and in the future when there are fewer and fewer priests available to serve these communities? If the parish of the future, at least locally here, is looking more and more like a one-priest parish, how do you serve these multiple and intersecting communities that have different languages and cultures that have to be understood and served?
I don't want to teach our cardinal what to do, but I like to say that maybe we Catholics, more than the Protestants, have missed to prepare lay leadership. See, every group, for instance, I have a young lady, the Filipino, and she can handle almost the whole community. I just tell her, we should do this. Okay, Father, you know, the next day comes back, you know, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 people ready to start. The Brazilians, I don't speak Portuguese, but we have the priest, but also they have 2 or 3 people that I can talk to. And especially the Italians, they go on their own. And practically my main work is liturgical, because, but the rest, I think we have to really empower these lay people, because they love the church as much and maybe more than we do. And what we do, we have the parish council where we meet everybody. So we have one representative for each group. They have to come to the parish council so everybody knows what's going on. And we get together for the calendar, for the spaces. But like I said, my biggest problem is how to make them work together. Because at this stage, they're still kind of encapsulated, as it says in the book. That means they work good. They are open, but they're still one group on their own. And they, you know, I feel like sometimes like the traffic police say, you know, go this way, this group this way, the other group the other way. But at the same time, I don't know yet how to really make one community.
But if you have a 6-hour event where you're hearing confessions, how do you draw in the people who aren't going to be speaking the language that you're most comfortable hearing confessions in?
Yeah, we have to provide. Luckily, in my area we have the Franciscan. They have a few priests to spare, so But if you really organize well the lay person, and I mean really people who really have the sense of community, a lot of work that we priests have to do is going to go in their hands.
Can I just jump into on that issue of cultural encapsulation? Because I wanted you to talk about that too.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's this great phrase that I wasn't familiar with before reading the book, and it's this process of people that are very deeply rooted and embedded in a particular culture, which is a very positive and rich and comforting thing, but to the point that they have a very difficult time seeing beyond their culture and understanding other cultures, and it leads to, in the book anyway, a lot of misconceptions about kind of other cultures in the shared parish. So if you could talk to both of us, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, at first, Beth, I think that's an excellent question, and I think that really where the rubber hits the road on this question is not in urban areas, because Father Walter, if pressed, you could kind of you could drum up a Brazilian priest in New York, but for example, in this parish in the Midwest, the priest, the Mexican priest who was there, he told me that he didn't know any other priests that were fully bilingual in the diocese. Now I don't know if that's really true, so some of it is those resources are not available in more rural areas. But I think there's also a symbolic character to this. I think sometimes it's not that Catholics want their priests to do everything, and I wholeheartedly agree with you, Father, about the encouragement of lay leadership and the dependence on it in ways in which we could depend a lot more on. I think what the priest functions more is like a living symbol. If he comes along, that means we're welcome here. But I think that priest is not the only symbol, and sometimes we can. And I think it sounds like your parish is doing marvelous work with, using other symbols to signal to people that yes, you are welcome here. And I could think of in terms of the religious art with the Italians, there's other ways of doing that I think says to people, yes, this is a place for us, which I think is really the issue. In terms of the other issue about encapsulation is a theory from psychology, actually. And it's the idea, it was meant for therapists, saying that, if you're doing therapy for somebody and they bring to you their concerns and they're from a different culture, that you may totally miss the boat because your knowledge, because you're encapsulated in your own world and your knowledge of their reality is actually way off. And so it leads to misconceptions. And one of my points in the book is that each cultural group in a shared parish gets kind of encapsulated. And the dominant culture gets more encapsulated because they don't have to go into the other culture. But if you're, in this case, if you're for where I live, if you're a Mexican immigrant who's doing service work or construction work, you have to live in the world of white people. But the white people don't have to live in the world of Mexicans. And I think, but it does lead to misconceptions, as Don said, and sometimes really strange things. Like one of the things I confronted was, and I think this happens a lot with financial issues. I'm sure Mar, you could talk about issues of this. But that people kept telling me, well, the reason that the Hispanics the collections at the Spanish Mass aren't as much as the English Mass is because, in Mexico, the government, funds all the churches, so they're not used to having to do that. Well, that is just not true. The church in Mexico funds the same way we do through voluntary contributions. But I think it's in our encapsulation, it's those kinds of misconceptions. Another one that was really bizarre was that because the Ku Klux Klan had come to town a few years ago because of the influx of immigrants, it's very anti-immigrant now, whatever that it still exists. But it was all out-of-towner people that did this demonstration, and it was stamped down by the city like you wouldn't believe, because the mayor said that the city would make a large donation to the Southern Poverty Law Center for each time that the KKK had a meeting in town. So they never appeared again. But many of the people in the Hispanic community had this idea that white members of the Catholic parish were members of the KKK. And this was like an extrapolation they made from their own experiences of racism, but was not true in any way. And I think the encapsulation leads to those kind of funny misunderstandings. And I'm sure in this room we could all tell some stories about that.
Yes.
My name is Jack. I live in Queens. I teach, which is probably the laboratory for all of the things you're talking
No,
about.
I'm sure it's
We're 50%. I teach geography of New York City, 100%. And I lead walking tours all over Queens. And I do my field work. And Queens is 50% foreign born. It's even higher among children and people in the labor force. Where I live in Flushing, there is a major temple or building or edifice for every major religion in the world. There are two kinds of processes that are happening in addition to what has been discussed here, which is very enlightening to me. And one is that there's another model for dealing with multiple ethnicities within one parish. And that's to just have another church. And that happened in the Lower East Side, and that happened in Williamsburg. There were just multiple churches. They were not all, people did not have to go to the church together. They had a Ukrainian church and an Irish church and an Italian church. So that's happened in Flushing now. There are two parishes in Flushing. One is St. John Vianney, and the other is St. Michael's, which is the first, 1836. Goes back, it's the first Catholic parish in Queens. Those are using the multiple model that you're talking about here. And you've got Hispanic immigrants, and you've got Chinese people, and the schools are filled with those kids, and they do the masses in 3 languages. Then you have the Koreans, who have built their own Catholic church. And I don't know how they did that. What did the church see? And it's a beautiful church. It's named for St. Paul Cho, something like that. He was the one that kicked, when the Portuguese introduced Catholicism to Korea, he was the one that kept Catholicism going for 100 years when the Portuguese weren't allowed to come in. And then there are all churches that locate themselves in immigrant neighborhoods, who are those soul seekers, like the Mormon Church and the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses, who are out there collecting souls wherever they can. There's a wonderful guy who's the superintendent of my building. He's just such a hard-working guy from Honduras. He's a Seventh-day Adventist now, and I'm sure he was a Catholic back in Honduras. He was. Then there's the need to make political coalitions between different ethnic groups. And there's a wonderful book written by Dr. Queen's College 25 years ago called The Future of Us All. How people got together in Elmhurst, which is one of the mixed neighborhoods of most of the community. Now those people formed political coalitions. So there's the need for political coalitions. There's the idea of how do you deal with all these other churches that want to snap away your members, and then there's the two models. And so I would welcome your comments on that, and I learned a lot from you, and thank you.
Thanks very much. We have just 5 to 7 minutes. So what I was thinking is, since we have a lot of questions, maybe we would do all the questions and then you all can answer them, or do you want to jump in right here? Is that okay? Is that okay way to do it? Yes.
My name's Tony Carnes. I'm from a journey to NYC religion. And I'm wondering if you talked about how do you get some unity, like says Father. And I'm wondering, supposedly diversity makes for a lot of innovation, new ideas. It seems like it should mean that you get each group gets new ideas and new ways of doing things from each other. And when, in other words, functional effectiveness is enhanced in that situation. But I haven't heard that happening, so I'm wondering if that is happening, if each one are getting new ideas from each other.
Okay, yes.
Hi, Brett. Sister Ruth Polarte from the Diocese of Metasha. You mentioned as one of the qualities that a pastor in leadership in a shared parish is dealing with conflict. Any other qualities of profile, like the leader, especially for the pastor in a shared parish, that in your experience maybe as we try to look for pastors especially that are going to be leading these shared parishes? Thank you.
Yes.
Tom Bedoin from Fordham University, the Graduate School of Religion. Two-part question. One, what are the implications for training pastoral workers from what you've been learning? What's the most important thing we should be doing right now? Second, what is a new theological question that has been raised for you that's hard to figure out as a result of all of this?
Yes, I'll have that.
Just the reality of a lot of priests coming from other countries to minister in the United States is part of the mix. So not to be under the impression that all these pastors are white, but there are a growing number of pastors, priests and pastors that are from India and from Latin America and from other places, Africa, which adds to the complexity and to the challenge of these.
Yeah, so let's stop there, but I wanted to add one more, which is which I think is really important. Because as I listen to you, I wonder, like, what exactly is the church trying to accomplish at this point with shared parishes? I mean, I kind of get it, but if you could speak to it, there's the themes of encounter, there's the themes of biblical hospitality. We used to talk about theology of migration, but there's a theology of communion here. There's kind of unity and diversity. I mean, what's if you could just kind of conceptualize it in a phrase at this point, or a sentence, what exactly are we about in trying to create unified parishes? And so you have a lot of stuff to answer there. The issue of, could we just have separate churches, ethnically separate churches? How do you get to unity? Dealing with conflict and other things that you're looking for in pastors, implications for training pastoral workers, and the reality of priests coming from different countries. So you all just want to go in order or respond to whatever you
Just about the unity, because I feel that very much. I want to keep a parish united, but I don't want to stifle or kill all the initiatives of the different groups. So right now I really don't know how to go about, but I'm trying to give enough space for each group so that they feel that they can do things. And at the same time, through few people, I'm trying to understand. I had an idea to, for instance, once a year to have a Feast of Nations, where each group will present their own culture, their music, their food, and so that other people can go around, by saying the big hall that we have, and go around and understand a little bit more of the other groups. Because like understanding will make it easier, but to unite without really killing the initiative of each group is still a big job to do.
Well, I'm not going to answer to all of them, but a couple of things that came to mind. Number one, the importance, going back to the encapsulation question, the importance of the parish and the parish leadership finding opportunities and creating moments and spaces for communities to come together. And it doesn't necessarily start with the liturgy. It might start with social events, parish festivals, opportunities where people can come and show off their stuff and share and create safe moments of prayer and sharing that will make people less and less afraid of being with one another. About the model of parishes, yes, there are other models. This is not the only. That was one of my points, but I didn't have time to go into that. I would say pastoral need will determine what is the best model for each situation. Because Brett, for example, talks in the book about the fact that this model of national parishes or ethnic parishes really was more for the European. Well, I can tell you from the Cultural Diversity Secretariat, Vietnamese and Koreans, also do prefer, and to some extent Chinese, do prefer their own communities. And they do find the means to build them if you let them. But you need to understand that this, with the Latinos, for example, is a very different situation. Why? Because of the numbers, just the sheer numbers. It would be impossible. But then you got also some Vietnamese communities in some, like Orange County, for example. There's so many that the diocese has forbidden, that they will be only national parishes for Vietnamese. Why? Because they are a huge percentage of the population. So, like the Latinos, they are pushing for them to be identified with the parishes in their neighborhood, and that the parish in the neighborhood would make room for them and will not only welcome them, but allow them to share everything on equal footing. So I would say pastoral need determines what's best. When you have smaller communities that need to be gathered, when there is no resources of priests and pastors, you need to gather everything in one community and then strengthen that community. And eventually next generations, they make the jump and then they realize, they decide where they go worshiping. So I'd say pastoral need, pastoral prudence is going to determine that. You also have situations like that, for example, going on in universities and even you have college parishes and things like that who are not don't fit your usual definition of parish. So for ethnic and cultural communities, sometimes the same principles apply: pastoral need, pastoral prudence.
Wow, this is a lot of stuff. I kind of maybe in reverse. I wanted to tackle this question: what is the church trying to accomplish with shared parishes? I'm not sure the church is trying to accomplish anything. And I'm not trying to be flip in that, but I don't think that this was. I mean, my guess is, Mata, that you would agree with me in the sense that I'm saying it. In that this was nobody's plan, right? This was what happened to accommodate an influx of immigrants in various places, with existing churches that already occurred, and with declining resources in terms of priests and money. So it may not even be the ideal situation. I think that in many ways the national parishes are more ideal, but they're often not possible. In this town where the All Saints came about, a Protestant pastor said, why don't you just have a church for the Mexicans and a church for the Anglos? And I said, that would be great if you could find, them, 3 more priests and a few $1 million, and part of that too is the centralized nature of authority in the Catholic Church. Like, the local pastor doesn't get to decide, and the local people don't get to decide who comes and under what circumstances. The bishop, has a great deal of influence, and now sometimes a pastor can say, well, we welcome these people, as obviously Father Walter has done, and Our Lady of Pompeii. And so I don't want to be. It's not that there are no congregationalist elements to it, but it also has to do with the way that the church is organized. If you want to say something to that.
Well, I think it's more than centralized authority. I think it's just one of the marks of identity of the Catholic Church that distinguishes it from other congregational churches, which is Catholicity. In canon law, the parish is a territory, and the pastor is responsible for all the souls in that territory. And so, really, a Catholic parish should seek and should welcome anybody that is, in that territory. And so, pastoral need again may determine otherwise. But I would think that it's not just a question of centralized authority, it's a question of parishes realizing that they need to become missionary entities and that they should welcome, everybody.
I would like to see a lot more of that than actually happens, but I think I agree with you.
We should.
I think in terms of what, Tom, your question about what is the theological question that's hard to figure out, and to me I think it's about, what Father Walter said about unity. Like, what do we think that unity is? And that, of course, has led me to kind of this perplexing question of communion ecclesiology in the Catholic Church. What is communion, and how does it work? And our Orthodox brothers and sisters have kind of taught us a lot about this. But I think we have not really thought about what practices of communion are. And I think in some ways this book is trying to begin that conversation of, how do we practice communion in our parishes and in our dioceses? I would say that's hospitality is also another complicated theological question. What should we do to train pastoral workers? I think I would say that I think we're always in the United States. We're tempted to think about what practical knowledge or skills that if we just learn this, then it can make the difference. But I think we should take a kind of page from moral theology and think about cultivating virtues. And I would say in terms of, because we cannot, in some ways, intercultural competence is what we like, but it's almost impossible in the world, especially in a place like New York. It is impossible to be competent in all the cultures that you're dealing with. Instead, I would hope that we can train people to be in 2 things, and one is curiosity. I am profoundly disturbed sometimes at the lack of curiosity that my students have about people that are different from them. And I think there's something just very human about this. And some people are naturally more curious across cultures than others. You become a Scalabrini priest if you do, or something like that. But I think this is a virtue we can cultivate in people, teach people to be curious, constantly give them experiences beyond their cultural comfort zone. And I think to a large extent this is already happening among young people in the way that the schools work. But the other one is what you might call social work was called cultural humility. The kind of envision, I think, especially white American men, we are the worst at this. We think that by the time we become 40 years old, we're experts on everything, and we have the right to speak to anyone about it in all circumstances. And I think instead we have to kind of cultivate in ourselves this kind of virtue of that life is a long project of learning, and we always have something to learn from somebody who's different from us. So I kind of think of that as cultural humility. Is diversity supposed to bring innovation? I thought that was a great point. And I think it does in the church. But I think you raise because of the encapsulation, because people don't know much about the realities of other cultural groups. And I don't think this is just a function, I want to be clear about this, I don't think this is just a function about how important culture is to us, it's a function of power differences. You know, that if you are in a position, if you have numbers or you have influence, then you don't have to learn about the cultures of other people. It's kind of the reason why, I always say that like Mexico and the United States, we have this big country syndrome. In other words, we don't think we need to know about anybody else because we have these huge countries. But if you go to like, you know, Belgium or El Salvador, you know, people have to learn about other cultures because they're so close to them. It's a generalization, but so I think sometimes the encapsulation is what keeps the functional effectiveness from kind of bleeding across cultures. But my guess is, and I don't have the data to back this up, is that it is happening, but people don't know that it's happening. Because somebody heard some idea from their friend who's from a different cultural group, they tried it here. And one of the perplexing things like for me was looking at the organizational structure of the Hispanic community in this parish and seeing how voluntaristic it was, which in many ways seems very American. You know, like we're the nation of joiners, right? But at the same time, there's a strong voluntarist tradition in Mexican political activism. So I don't think it was totally foreign to people. So I'm not really sure always how these qualities come together or bleed across cultures. I think that was it. Just about international priests. So many of them are pastors. I think if I could say anything about that, it's that depending on what a priest's experience is in his own culture, depends on whether he should be sent to a parish that has multiple cultures. Some people come from very encapsulated areas where they don't interact with a lot of other cultures, even if the other cultures are part of their country, their national. I mean, I think of like Igbo priests from Nigeria. They are mostly ministering in areas that are entirely Igbo, and it's much more challenging for them to minister across cultures. But Filipino priests are often, you know, mission to many multiple cultural groups. Okay, sorry.
Well, we should end because we're over time, but I wanted to really thank Brett and Mar and Walter for coming. And thank you all. It was really a terrific session.